Hello and welcome to lecture number 46. This is topic 3.11, the New Negro Movement and the Harlem Renaissance. There's one learning objective today, and that's to describe the ways the New Negro Movement emphasized self-definition, racial pride, and cultural innovation. The New Negro Movement was popularized by writer Alain Locke's The New Negro, published in 1925. This was a collection of essays and poems by various writers in Harlem, including Zora Neale Hurston. The movement represented an assertive spirit among African Americans, spanning political, economic, and social realms. It advocated for full and equal access to the vote, equal wages compared to white counterparts, access to labor unions to collectively bargain for higher wages, and social equality, especially in combating segregation and Jim Crow laws. The New Negro Movement encouraged African Americans to define their identity through various cultural expressions. This was achieved via literary, visual, and performing arts, as well as the expansion of Black historical scholarship. Carter G. Woodson, a central figure of the movement, established Negro History Week in 1926, which later evolved into Black History Month. He also founded the Journal of Negro History, which was vital in publishing research on African American history and reframing historical narratives from a Black perspective. This shift in academic focus helped to combat the often racist historical accounts common in mainstream scholarship at the time. Woodson's efforts were part of a broader trend to ensure that African American contributions to history and culture were not erased or misrepresented. Politically, African Americans were also advocating for themselves amid the Red Summer of 1919, a period of severe racial violence in multiple U.S. cities. Riots broke out in cities such as Chicago, Washington, D.C., and Elaine, Arkansas, leaving hundreds of African Americans dead and many communities devastated. In response, civil rights organizations expanded. We've discussed the NAACP before, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was instrumental in advocating for anti-lynching laws, but during this period, the Urban League also became prominent. Unlike the NAACP, which focused on legal battles, the Urban League provided support to African Americans in cities, particularly in employment and housing. The Urban League's work was crucial as millions of African Americans moved to urban centers during the Great Migration, requiring assistance with adjusting to the new environments and finding jobs. The largest political organization to arise from the Negro Movement was the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA, led by Marcus Garvey. Garvey promoted a separatist vision for African Americans, emphasizing racial pride and Black nationalism. His movement advocated for the economic empowerment of Black communities and the creation of a self-sufficient Black nation. By 1920, the UNIA hosted an international convention at Madison Square Garden, showcasing its global reach and influence. The UNIA grew rapidly with over 4 million members worldwide, making it one of the largest Black mass movements in history. Garvey's Back to Africa movement, though controversial, aimed to establish a colony in Liberia where African Americans could escape racial oppression in the United States. We will explore the UNIA further in topic 3.18. Garvey's movement also initiated conversations about Pan-Africanism, influencing future leaders like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya. Art played a major role in the New Negro Movement, giving rise to what we now call the Harlem Renaissance. A new Black aesthetic emerged with African American artists producing work for their own communities rather than catering to white audiences. This artistic production contributed to the broader freedom struggle, portraying African Americans positively, whether by celebrating cultural achievements or depicting them in a more human and dignified light. This artistic renaissance was a crucial counterpoint to the racist caricatures of Black people that had dominated American media and culture for decades, particularly in minstrel shows and early cinema. Here are the three major artists who helped shape the Black aesthetic. First was Aaron Douglas. He was an illustrator whose work combined influences from Egyptian and West African art, as well as Cubism and Art Deco styles popular in the early 20th century. His modernist style and use of African motifs made him one of the most influential visual artists of the Harlem Renaissance. He illustrated The New Negro and contributed to the periodical Fire, which was a short-lived but revolutionary publication that rejected respectability politics and promoted unapologetic Black creativity. Douglas's murals, such as Aspects of Negro Life in 1934, commissioned by the Works Progress Administration, are considered masterpieces depicting the Black experience from slavery to freedom. Augusta Savage was a renowned sculptor, noted for her ability to capture Black facial features with striking realism and pride. She was a prominent advocate for African American artists, founding the Harlem Community Art Center in 1937, where she taught many aspiring artists, including Jacob Lawrence and Norman Lewis. One of her most famous sculptures, the harp, inspired by the hymn Lift Every Voice and Sing, was displayed at the 1939 World's Fair. Despite its critical acclaim, like many of Savage's work, the harp was tragically destroyed after the exhibition due to a lack of funding for permanent preservation. And finally, Archibald Motley. He painted scenes of black urban life, especially focusing on the vibrant social and cultural life in Chicago's South Side. His works emphasized joy, culture, and community through depictions of nightclubs, jazz musicians, and everyday life. Motley's painting Nightlife from 1943, which depicts a crowded jazz club, is one of his best-known works, illustrating the energy of the Harlem Renaissance and the rise of black popular culture. Motley was also unique in exploring the complexity of racial identity, as seen in a series of portraits including the Octroon Girl in 1925, which delved into the intricacies of mixed-race identity in America. These artists, along with many others, formed the core of the Harlem Renaissance visual arts movement, which redefined the way African Americans were represented in art. Their work not only reflected African heritage, but also addressed contemporary social issues such as racial pride, identity, and the struggles of black life in America. This movement helped pave the way for future generations of black artists and contributed to the cultural and intellectual framework for the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. These cultural innovations were not limited to art. They also served to counteract the prevailing racial stereotypes of the time, which often portrayed African Americans as intellectually inferior or suited only for subordinate roles. The artist expression of the Harlem Renaissance were rooted in the broader Great Migration, during which 6 million African Americans moved from the rural South to northern and Midwestern cities between 1910 and 1970. Harlem, Chicago, and Detroit became major cultural hubs for black Americans during this period. This mass migration reshaped the demographics of many northern cities and altered the political landscapes, increasing African American voting power and influence in urban areas. By 1930, Harlem was home to over 200,000 African Americans, making it the largest concentration of black people in the world at the time. This contributed to Harlem becoming the epicenter of black culture and intellectual life in the U.S. Music also reflected these migratory shifts. Blues and jazz, both rooted in the South, found new expressions in northern cities. Jazz, which originated in New Orleans, rapidly spread to cities like Chicago and New York during this time, evolving into different forms. Duke Ellington, a central figure of the Harlem Renaissance, developed big band's jazz style and was a key performer at the famous Cotton Club in Harlem. Ellington's innovative compositions and orchestral leadership transformed jazz into a more sophisticated and internationally recognized genre. Bessie Smith, often called the Empress of the Blues, and Ma Rainey, known as the Mother of the Blues, continued to popularize the blues, bringing the deep emotional resonance of the South's black life to Northern American audiences. Their songs often told stories of hardship, love, and resilience, resonating with African Americans who had experienced the trials of migration and discrimination. And Louis Armstrong. He was a defining figure in jazz. He revolutionized the genre with his virtuosic trumpet playing and innovative improvisational style. His influence on the future generations of musicians was profound, shaping the development of jazz as an art form. Armstrong's work in the 1920s, especially with his Hot 5 and Hot 7 bands, helped solidify the role of the soloist in jazz music, which was a break from the earlier collective improvisation style. In visual art, we have discussed Archibald Motley, but we should also highlight Louis Mailou Jones, a pivotal figure who incorporated African motifs such as masks and textiles into her work. Jones studied at the Académie Julian in Paris, where she was able to develop her style free from the racial restrictions she faced in the U.S. Her use of African symbolism was part of a broader trend during the Harlem Renaissance to reclaim African heritage as a source of pride and identity. This movement towards African themes was also influenced by the growing interest in Pan-Africanism during the 1920s, spearheaded by figures like Marcus Garvey. Jacob Lawrence, another prominent artist, produced his iconic Migration series, a collection of 60 paintings that depicted the experiences of African Americans during Great Migration. Lawrence, who was only 23 when he compiled the series in 1941, captured the hardships and hopes of the millions who left the South in search of better opportunities in the North. He also created an earlier series that we've looked at on the Haitian Revolution and the life of Toussaint Louverture. Lawrence's work was groundbreaking in its storytelling approach, using modernist style and bold colors to narrate the history of African American resilience and struggles. In literature, Alain Locke remained a key figure, holding a PhD from Harvard, and he was the first African American Rhodes Scholar in 1907. Locke was a key architect of the Harlem Renaissance, and his anthology The New Negro became the manifesto for the movement, calling for black artists to take pride in their heritage and reject white patronage or control. His intellectual influence extended beyond the arts to the philosophy of cultural pluralism, which emphasized the value of all cultures in a diverse society. The Harlem Renaissance also gave rise to Langston Hughes, one of the most influential poets of the 20th century, known for his depictions of everyday Black life, his celebration of Black culture, and his engagement with the struggle of Black Americans. Hughes was a major figure in the movement's embrace of jazz poetry, a form that mirrored the rhythms and improvisations of jazz music. His famous poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, became a defining work of the Harlem Renaissance. Hughes was not only a poet but also a playwright, novelist, and essayist, using his writings to promote racial pride and challenge social injustice. Finally, Zora Neale Hurston was a novelist and essayist, also gained prominence during this time. Her work often highlighted the folklore, oral traditions, and dialects of the Black South where she was from. Hurston's landmark novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, broke new ground by focusing on the interior life and independence of Black women, which was a radical departure from the portrayal of Black women in earlier literature. Though Hurston faced criticism during her lifetime for not being politically vocal enough, her work has since been recognized as crucial to Black feminist thought and African American literature. Her anthropological work documenting African American and Caribbean cultures also laid important groundwork for future studies on folklore and ethnography. These figures collectively shaped a cultural revolution that not only redefined African American identity, but also changed American art, music, and literature permanently. The Harlem Renaissance emphasis on self-expression and cultural pride set the stage for future social and political movements. The new Negro movement included key components such as the Great Migration, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and the New Negro Renaissance. These elements collectively represented a cultural, political, and social shift within African American communities during the early 20th century. The Harlem Renaissance was the most famous cultural manifestation of this movement, but it wasn't limited to Harlem. It was part of a broader cultural flowering that included other cities like Chicago, which also became an important center of Black intellectual and artistic life. Alain Locke referred to Harlem as the race capital, recognizing its significance as a hub of Black thought, creativity, and leadership. By the 1920s, Harlem had established itself as the epicenter of African American culture, attracting writers, artists, musicians, and intellectuals from across the country. Several influential institutions and venues were established in Harlem, reinforcing its role in the Cultural Revolution. The New York Age, one of the leading Black newspapers, was a major platform for civil rights advocacy and cultural commentary. Other important publications like the Amsterdam News provided coverage of both Harlem's artistic achievements and the ongoing social issues faced by Black Americans. Harlem was also home to the famous clubs like Cotton Club, where celebrated performers like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington regularly entertained. Despite being a segregated venue that only allowed white patrons, the Cotton Club's reliance on Black performers ironically helped elevate Black music, especially jazz, into the mainstream. Another iconic venue was the Apollo Theater, which became a focal point for Black entertainment. The Apollo's Amateur Nights, launched in 1934, would go on to discover future legends such as Ella Fitzgerald and James Brown, solidifying its status as a launching pad for Black talent. One of the most significant milestones in Black theatrical performances was Shuffle Along, the first African-American musical produced on Broadway in 1921. Written by Noble Sissy and U.B. Blake, the musical broke racial barriers by featuring a Black cast and creative team, and it became a commercial success. The musical introduced hit songs like I'm Just Wild About Harry and inspired the development of future Black musicals. It played a key role in demonstrating that African American performers and playwrights could succeed in mainstream American theater, paving the way for future Black productions on Broadway. And to recap, the new Negro movement encouraged African Americans to define their identity and advocate for themselves politically. It produced a Black aesthetic, and its innovations in music and art and literature served as counter-narratives to prevailing racial stereotypes. Finally, the movement encompassed several political and cultural developments, including the Harlem Renaissance, which shaped the landscape of American culture. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushlights.com/AFAM. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.